Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the profound and honestly super complex 500-year history of Cuba. And we're going way beyond the classic cars and cigars that usually dominate the tourist postcards. Let's start with a bit of a paradox, right? How does a nation that is so famous for its pristine manatee highways, minty rum mojitos, and this unbelievably vibrant music also house such profound poverty and a strict one-party state with Marxism-Leninism as its official ideology? You've got this reality where some citizens live in very modest conditions, while others are in these grand, decaying mansions from a totally different era. To really understand how we got to this modern reality, we've got to rewind the clock. So here is the game plan. We're going to trace the 6 major historical fires that forged this unique nation. 1. The roots of Cuba. 2. Struggles for independence. 3. Revolution and the Cold War. 4. The Cuban socialist state. 5. Culture, identity, and diaspora. And finally 6. Cuba at a crossroads. Let's dive right in.
Section 1. The Roots of Cuba. Our journey actually starts long before 1492. The island was defined by some pretty stark early contrasts. On one hand, you had the Ciboney people. They arrived thousands of years earlier from South America, living as nomadic hunter-gatherers. On the flip side, you had the Tainos, who arrived later from the east. They were completely different, sedentary with advanced agriculture and a super rich, dynamic culture. Eventually, the Tainos largely assimilated or overtook the Ciboneys, setting up these incredibly sophisticated societies long before European contact.
Now, what's really striking about this next era is just how incredibly fast Spanish colonization escalated. Columbus makes landfall in 1492, initially thinking he'd hit islands off the coast of Asia. By 1511, Diego Velázquez establishes the very first Spanish settlement, Baracoa. But the real game-changer hits in the 1520s. Cuba's semi-tropical climate was absolutely perfect for sugarcane, which was basically the most lucrative crop on Earth at the time. This massive agricultural shift brought totally unknown diseases like smallpox that literally decimated the indigenous populations, which then ushered in the brutal African slave trade to feed the massive labor demands of this new, incredibly lucrative sugar empire.
Section 2. Struggles for independence. Fast forward to the 19th century, and you see this fierce, relentless 30-year fight against Spanish rule. It all kicks off with the 10 Years' War in 1868, when Eastern landowners freed their slaves to build a rebel army. That laid the groundwork for the War of Independence in 1895, led by figures like José Martí. Ultimately, this localized fight exploded into an American intervention after the mysterious sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor. That short Spanish-American War in 1898 effectively kicked out the Spanish, but it completely complicated Cuba's sovereignty. The real catch-22 here is the Platt Amendment of 1901. This was a set of strict conditions the U.S. forced Cuba to write right into its new constitution. It severely limited Cuba's ability to sign international treaties, mandated U.S. review of Cuban finances, and gave U.S. troops the green light to intervene literally any time they deemed it necessary for stability. Oh, and it also established the naval base at Guantanamo Bay. So it legally tethered the island's independence straight back to American interests, generating, as you can imagine, immense resentment.
Section 3. Revolution and the Cold War. All that simmering resentment over foreign influence and domestic corruption totally boiled over in the mid-20th century. You had this stark political divide. On one side, Fulgencio Batista's military dictatorship, an increasingly authoritarian and corrupt regime backed by the U.S., but utterly failing to deliver any real economic change for everyday Cubans. On the other side, Fidel Castro's revolution. Castro utilized guerrilla warfare to build this massive, wide-ranging coalition of students, bourgeois professionals, and rural peasants, promising sweeping agrarian and social reforms. This movement successfully overthrew Batista in January 1959.
From there, the Cold War escalation was just dizzying. Castro takes power in 1959. By 1960, Cuba declares itself a socialist state, heavily nationalizing foreign-owned enterprises and striking deals with the Soviet bloc. Boom. In response, the U.S. snaps diplomatic relations in 1961. And then, October 1962, the entire world is brought to the absolute brink of nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis, right after American intelligence spotted Soviet ballistic missiles deployed on the island.
Section 4. The Cuban Socialist State.
Following all those intense standoffs, Cuba radically restructured its whole society and economy through a Marxist-Leninist framework, heavily subsidized by the Soviet Union. But then, take a look at this number, $4.5 billion.
That is the massive amount of foreign currency inflows Cuba lost, basically overnight when the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s. It plunged the island into severe economic devastation, a totally brutal era officially called the Special Period. Gross investment hit rock bottom, and the country had to frantically scramble just to survive.
And compounding these domestic struggles are the external pressures of decades-long U.S. economic sanctions. Statutes like the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 and the Cuban Democracy Act of 1992 were designed to isolate the Castro regime. However, these laws have severely restricted international banking, blocked foreign investment, and choked off the flow of remittances, bringing heavy financial and everyday social costs directly down on ordinary citizens. Because of all this, today, Cuba faces a debt overhang of over $18 billion in unserviced financial obligations. $18 billion. This astronomical debt paralyzes their ability to access international financial markets or invest in desperately needed productive infrastructure. It is literally one of the nation's biggest systemic bottlenecks.
Section 5. Culture, Identity, and Diaspora.
Now, despite these incredibly heavy geopolitical and economic burdens, the Cuban spirit is just unshakable. It's a resilience best felt through the island's culture. You can almost feel it in this quote. Imagine this sweet smell of sugarcane and tobacco, existing right alongside a landscape where wealth and poverty atypically coexist. But above all, there's the music. It's a sound richer than a heartbeat, rolling through the streets, serving as the unyielding pulse of the people. And that resilience is literally baked into the food. Cuban cuisine is this incredible hybrid Creole mix of Spanish sauces, indigenous roots, and African influences. Now, after 1959, the state imposed cooperatives and strict food rationing, which threatened to make everything completely monotonous. But Cuban home cooking, it refused to fade. Today, it is constantly evolving, with amazing new gastronomic innovations blooming all the time despite the severe limitations. However, we also have to talk about how the island's hardships have created a massive diaspora. And this isn't just a new phenomenon. Back in 1868, cigar workers and laborers formed a huge exodus to New York. Then in 1959, fearing the new revolutionary regime, the middle and upper classes fled to Miami. By 1980, over 1 million Cubans lived in the diaspora. This forged a deeply distinct, incredibly powerful Cuban-American identity abroad, one that stays intensely connected to and politically invested in what happens back in the homeland.
Section 6. Cuba at a crossroads. Which brings us to today, where Cuba is navigating an incredibly uncertain future. The last decade alone has delivered absolute diplomatic whiplash in U.S.-Cuba relations. In 2014, the Obama administration sparked a historic rapprochement, restoring relations and easing travel. It was huge. But then, in 2017, the Trump administration slammed the brakes, reinstating bans and pushing back hard. This intense volatility is driven by ongoing congressional pressures, unresolved issues over nationalized assets, and persistent human rights concerns under the Cuban government.
The crucial takeaway here is that internal attempts at economic liberalization, like the highly touted 2011 reforms, have largely stalled out. They just couldn't reverse the structural decay that started way back when the Soviets left. As a result, the economy is trapped in a downward spiral. Productivity is dropping, everyday Cubans are facing severe deprivations, and many are increasingly forced to turn to an expanding illegal black market just to survive under a totally outdated economic model. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a profound question. Cuba is standing at a historic crossroads right now. Will it stubbornly stick to its traditional socialist state model? Will it pivot to mimic the market socialism of places like China and Vietnam? Or will all this economic pressure lead to a push for an entirely new civil society? Whatever happens, the shockwaves are going to ripple far beyond the shores of this resilient Caribbean island. Thank you for joining me to explore the complex crucible of Cuba. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.